Hi everyone, and welcome to a brand new series where we will learn how to deploy a web application to a production server. So in this series we are going to deploy a Flask web application, and we are going to use a lot of new technologies that are very exciting, like Docker and Docker Compose and a lot more. So I'm going to divide this series into three important sections, where in this one we will learn how we can Dockerize a Flask application, and also in the second one we will learn about Docker Compose and how we can run multiple containers using only one command line utility, and in the third part we are going to grab the new structure project to a production server using Linode. Now, before you go with this series, I would recommend watching my 40-minute Docker getting started video, just for you to really have a basic understanding about how containers work and what is Docker. So in this series you will learn really a lot of new technologies that will help you to deploy your applications very easily on production. And just a quick side note, if you are new on this channel, then welcome, and I'm really glad that you are here. And if you will enjoy the content of this series, please consider hitting the like button and as well as subscribing to my channel to really spread this video across more people. Alright, let's get started. Alright, so this is the Flask project that we have developed throughout this series of Flask. Now, if you remember, we had a very specific structure that basically each package is divided into a directory, and then we had this one external Python file that comes in and imports those packages and it executes this application. So if you remember, we had this run.py file that looks something like that. And basically we import this app from the market package that we have created, and then we check if this file is running directly from Python, and then we execute this run method with debug mode equals to true. Now, if you don't have right now a Flask project on your hand and you just want to practice deployment, then you can get this project from my GitHub. So it will be as easy as navigating through this URL in here and going to this last folder, which is the latest update that I have completed to this entire project. And then you can see that it is equal to what we have in PyCharm. So you can download this project from GitHub, and basically I will provide the link of that in the description as well. So let me go back to PyCharm and continue from here. So our first step will be to create a specific file that is called requirements.txt file. And the reason we want to create such a file, it is because we want to provide each dependency that this Flask application needs to execute successfully, so it will be easier to design this Flask application to being run inside a Docker container. So I will do that, and please make sure that you create this outside of your package directory and you create this in the root directory of your project. So I will go here and I will say requirements.txt like that. And now I will basically provide the packages that we have used pip install for, just to basically install those packages. So first of them was Flask, so I will say that, and basically each line will present a library that we have installed. So I will continue on by saying Flask-SQL Alchemy like that, because this was just another library that we have installed. And we also had Flask-WTF like that. Excuse me, this should be underscore. And we also got WT forms like the following, and email-validator. And we got three more here, which is Flask bcrypt and also Flask_login like that. Now, the last library that I want to include within this requirements.txt file is related to the way that we are going to connect to our production database. Now, using the local SQLite tree file as a production database is something that is considered as not secure, and it is a greater idea to have a dedicated service and then we can use it as a database. So in our case, we are going to use something that is called Postgres Postgres, and this is why we have to use a specific library that will help us to connect our Flask application to the expected Postgres service that is going to execute on our production server in the future. So this is why I'm going to say PSY COPG2 like that, and that will basically be the library that will help us to connect our Flask application to the Postgres database. So this should be enough, and I will now close our requirements.txt and continue from here. Okay, so now that we have the requirements.txt file, it is a great idea to start designing our Dockerfile. Now, the Dockerfile is basically what is going to define the image of the container that we expect to execute, whether if in our local host machine or in a production server. And then we are going to have a separated configuration for each of those environments. One configuration for production and another configuration where we will use it when we want to basically improve this application in the future. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to create this Dockerfile like that. And I'm going to basically design this Dockerfile to support running Flask applications. So I will start by pulling the built-in Python image, which is going to look like from, and I will say Python : 3 like that. And now we are going to set one environment variable that will ensure that the logs of our Flask application will be sent directly to the terminal, and that is called a built-in environment variable that we have to set it to 1. So I'm going to say env, which is the convention to create an environment variable within our container, and I will say Python unbuffered 1 like that. So it will set the value of this environment variable to 1. And I will continue on by saying run make directory, and I will use /code like that. Now this will go ahead and basically create an empty directory within our container. And then I want to say that this is going to be my working directory. So I will say work dir /code like that. And then I will start copying everything to this expected /code directory that is going to be created within our container. So I will start first by copying our requirements.txt and installing each of the dependencies on this container. So I will say copy, and then I will say requirements.txt, and I will copy that inside the /code like that. And I will use here one more / just to make ensure that this file is going to be sent to the code directory that we have created. And now I can say something like run pip install -r requirements.txt. So this line is actually a very critical line, and it is important to provide it because we want to make sure that each of our dependencies are going to be installed within our container. So this is why we have to run this line. And then I can copy the entire project to the code directory that we have created. So I can say again copy, and then I can copy everything from this directory. So I can say dot, and I will copy everything to the code directory once again, and then our container is pretty much ready now. So now that I have done this, then I have to basically execute the run.py file, which is going to be inside the code directory that we have created here. And if you remember, I changed our working directory in this line. So I can directly say cmd, which is going to be the kind of entry point of our container. And I will say here Python run.py like that. And this will make sure that this container is going to execute until we exit it, this run.py file, which is this file, and then this file runs the application. So our Docker file now looks good, and we can continue from here. Alright, so there is one final thing that we have to make sure before we go ahead and build this image based on that Docker file. Now I'm going to go inside our run.py file, and whatever file that you have that basically executes your application. And I'm going to talk about this run method a little bit, which is coming from this app variable, which is basically an instance of Flask. So this run method by default is going to execute your application within this specific IP that is called as localhost IP address, which is looking like 127.0.0.1, and we'd like to change it because this application is going to run inside a container, and this is why we have to somehow reconfigure this IP address. So the way that we are going to do this is easily going to be by overriding the host attribute of this run method. So I'm going to say host is equal to, and I will open string in here, and then I will use a comma to separate from this debug. Now the value that we want to insert in here is going to look something like the following. And the reason we want to do this, it is because 4 times 0 IP address, it is a convention IP address that will basically enable connection for all network interfaces. And this is something that we want to execute web-based services in Docker containers, so it will be easier to expose the connection from the container to our local host. So this is why we'd like to execute this application on that specific IP address. And I don't want to be too much detailed about this specific information, but just remember it as a convention that you have to apply when you want to Dockerize your applications. Okay, so the port is something that you can override as well. Now I know that by default it is going to be 5000, but I think that it will be nicer to have it declared in here as well. So I'm going to say port is equal to 5000 like that. Now if we take a look to this run.py file, there's actually one more thing that we can create generic, and this is this debug value. Now if you know or not, but there's actually an option to pass environment variables to a running Docker container on demand. So I'm going to turn this debug equals to true to an expression that is going to check for a value of a specific environment variable, and if it matches, then it will end up by returning it true, and then we can have our application both on debug mode or not in debug mode, depending on the environment variable that we are going to pass in the future. So for that purpose, I am going to go here and I'm going to say import OS like the following, and this is actually the operating system library that will support reading environment variables. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to change this expression to something like os.environ.get, and I'm going to check if the debug environment variable is equal to 1 like that. And when I do something like this and pass in debug equals 1 as an environment variable, then this expression will go ahead and return true, and then we will have debug mode for our application. And if we don't pass this environment variable, then this expression will return false. So now we have more options on different modes that we can run our application. So now we are ready to go to our terminal and start building this image and try to execute this as a container to really see if everything works properly or not. Okay, so I'm inside our terminal, and here we are going to build our image based on the Docker file that we have wrote. Now there's a great chance that you don't have Docker installed on your computer, so maybe you want to take a look to the recent video that I released about Docker. And in this video you're also going to see the installation process on Windows, so maybe this could be helpful for you. But if you use Linux and you have already installed Docker, then you should be fine by writing these commands and execute them. Okay, so I'm going to say here docker build, and I'm going to use dot to refer to the current directory, and we are going to tag this image, and we can say t like the following, and the tag that I'm going to give is going to be Flask app dev. So the reason I'm adding dev, it is because I want to test if it works on development environment, and this is why I added this tag. Now if I execute this, then let's see the results of that. Okay, so it gets builded and it is going to now install all the requirements, and then let's see if it is going to be completed in just few seconds. So now I think that everything is ready. Okay, so now we can basically clean our screen a bit, and let's actually remember this one. So I'm going to copy that and clean the screen and paste this in here. So now we want to run a container based on this Flask app dev image, and it is going to be by saying docker run, and we are going to refer to this tag. And now before we execute this command, there are going to be some more additional arguments that we have to specify. Now, if you remember, I said that we have to figure out how we are going to expose the connection within a container through our local host. So there's actually a built-in argument to specify this information. So I'm going to say -p, and then I'm going to provide in the port that we like to execute on our local host, and also I'm going to provide the port that this application is running on the container side. So in our side we'd like to execute this on port 5000, so I'm going to say that, and on the container side it is also running on the 5000 port, so I'm going to say colon and specify the 5000 one more time. So this should be enough for the -p argument that we're going to pass in. And also we want to pass in -e, which stands for environment variables that you can pass in on demand when this container is going to be executed. And if you remember, we'd like to test this container in debug true mode. So I'm going to say debug equals to 1 like that, and this should be enough to basically execute this container like we'd expect to. So I'm going to execute this now, and now you can see that it shows us that it runs on here and the debugger is active. So it means that we have done everything properly, and now we'd like to test if this application executes properly in web browser. So I'm going to open my web browser and I'm going to test if this works properly. So I'm going to say 127.0.0.1 like that, and the port will be 5000. So if I run that, then you can see that we have this application running under containers successfully, and you can also see that from the logs from the terminal, because it really shows you the information about some traffic coming in. So this means that we were able to set up everything perfect, and we can continue from here. Okay, so before we go to the next step, I'd like to comment this long command that we have executed in order to run our application in debug mode. So I'm going to go back to our terminal for a minute, and I'm going to copy this command, and I'm going to paste this in here just to really have a nice documentation of the command that needs to be executed to run the application in debug mode. Now I will change this to image name to make it more dynamic, and I will also say here run this command to run the application in debug mode. So now we will have a nice documentation of everything. Okay, so the next step that we'd like to do now is to configure a separated configuration for our databases, whether if we run on development mode or in production mode. So if you remember, I said earlier about this Postgres service that we are going to launch on the production server. So this is why we have to configure our application to check if the application is running in debug mode. And if it runs in debug mode, then there is nothing wrong to read the information from an SQLite tree file that we have in the root directory of this project, which is right here. But if we run this application on production, which means that we don't pass in this debug equals to 1 environment variable, then we'd like to connect our application to Postgres database. And now we'd like to write a configuration for both of the cases. So for that purpose, I'm going to go inside our market directory and I'm going to create a config.py file. Now for your Flask application, you can create it wherever you want, but since this is the way we designed this application in the Flask series, then I'm going to straightforward create it under our package name, which is market. So I'm going to create a Python file and name it config like that. Alright, so we are inside this empty file that is called config. So here we want to create two variables that will maintain information about dev database and production database. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say, and I will do this in uppercase, so this really defines that this is a configuration that is going to include some info, and I will make that to be equal to the same location of the current database that we have set up throughout the Flask queries. So I'm going to copy the value from _init.py file, which is that one. And I'm going to paste this in here like that. Now for prod_db, we'd like to first set up some variables before, because when we want to connect to a database like Postgres, there are going to be some credentials that you have to configure by default. So before we actually set up the value of this, then I will go up top and create some variables first. So I will start by declaring the user that is going to have access to this Postgres server. So I'm going to say PG just to make it as a shortened version of Postgres, and I will say _user, and we will name it admin, and I will also say PG_pass, which is going to be equal to admin as well, just to make our lives a little bit easier. And I'm going to also specify the database name that we like to instantiate when we execute a Postgres service. So let's call our database market like we have done for the SQLite 3. And I'm going to say PG_DB, and I'm going to make this to be equal to market. And now I will say PG_host, and this will be equal to localhost, because if we think about it, on our production server that we are going to create on one of the cloud providers, then the Postgres instance is going to run on the same server as the Flask web application. So this is why we'd like to specify localhost. And the port of this service that we'd like to instantiate in the production server is going to be 5432 like that. And I'm going to make this to be equal to a variable name that we can name it PG_port like that. Now I know that storing an information like password within our code is not so great idea, but I just want to keep things simple and just go straight forward with the deployment process, because anyway we have a lot of information that we need to cover in this tutorial, so I don't want to be too much focusing on the security thing and just basically show things straightforward when it comes to deployment. But you can provide those information as an additional environment variables as well to really make sure that the secure of your application is strong enough. Okay, so now we want to customize this prod_db variable that we said that we should customize. So I'm going to make this to be equal to an f string first, and I'm going to say PostgreSQL, and I will add colon / twice like that. And now we are going to create this string with all the pieces of information that we have created there and design the URI connection to that Postgres service. So I'm going to say here PG user, so we will refer to the value of it by this way, and I will use colon outside of this variable, and I will call the value of PG_pass, and then I will use the @ and I will refer to the PG_host, and then I will use the colon sign again, and I will specify PG_port. So this is how it looks until now, and I know that this might look very confusing, but this is actually the method that you can create a URI that will define the connection to some service, and this is why I'm doing that. And now the final piece of information that we have to refer to is the PGDB here. So we are going to use / and refer to its value like that. Okay, so now I'd like to split the panes to make a better look, so I will do that for a minute. And now it looks better. Okay, so if you remember, we had our _init.py file when we instantiated this Flask application with this line. And this file is also including some important information about the configuration of the application. Now, if you pay attention, we have this line that we'd like to change it, and it needs to be enough dynamic to support both development mode and production mode. Now, if you remember, we have this environment variable that we pass in on demand when we run our containers. So we can do something like the following. So I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to use an if statement up top to really make sure that we check if debug equals to 1 is passed in or not. So I'm going to use here something like import OS again, and I will say if os.environ.get, and I will refer to debug value, and I will check if it equals to 1 within a string like that. Now, if it equals to 1, then I will make that to be equal to the dev.db that we have created here. So I need to import those configurations from our init.py file. So I'm going to say from market.config import devdb and proddb like that. And I'm going to make this to be equal to devdb, and if we don't hit this conditional, then we'd like to make this statement to be equal to proddb like that. And now everything looks a lot more clean, and we have this functionality that supports both of the cases if we run our application in debug mode or not. Alright, so now that we have implemented those changes, then it is a great idea to test things up before we go further with this deployment process. So I'm going to open our terminal, and I'm going to rebuild our image just to make sure that our next container is going to grab the latest changes that we have applied. So I'm going to say docker build, and I will provide the dot sign, and I will say -t, and I will say flask_app like that. Now this is a different tag than the other one, but it really doesn't matter too much. So I'm going to execute that, and now we have an image with this tag. So now let's see if the application is going to run on debug mode and it is going to fail on production mode. Because currently on my local machine, I don't have any PostgreSQL server that really runs. So we should expect for some failures, and that is perfect because it means that our configuration works properly. So I'm going to clean our screen, and I'm going to grab the exact command that we have commented out. So I'm going to open our run.py and grab this command from here like that, and I'm going to paste this in here. And now we'd like to change this to flask_app like that, because this is the new image that we have built. Now we can also change the port of the local server, which is our machine, when we execute this container. So we can actually change the port on the left side of this entire expression to change the port that is going to run. So we can say maybe 5001, and now if we run this, then you can see that we still receive debugger is active. Now I know that this might confuse you that you see this yet, but this actually comes from the container, so that is okay, because we only exposed to a different port on our local server and not inside the container. So I'm going to open our browser again and really test if this works properly on the new port. So I'm only going to change this to 5001, and now you can see that it works great again. So if I click on get started, then the login page shows here as well, and it really looks like everything works. Now I'm going to quit that and try to execute the latest command again, and that time I'm not going to pass in the debug equals to 1. So I'm going to clean our screen and relaunch the latest command, and I will only remove that from here, and we can decide now that we'd like to test this out on a total different port, which is 5002. So I'm going to run that, and now you can see that we don't receive anymore the message of debugger is active, and we actually see debug mode off. So again, I'm going to go to our browser and change this to 5002, and you can see that although it works, but I will show you where it will fail. So if I try to authorize and provide some credentials to log in, this is where the Flask will attempt to have a connection with a database, and this is the exact point that we should expect for a failure. So we can say just something like that, we can provide some random credentials, and we can try to sign in. And now you can see that it shows us that there are no connections of this PostgreSQL server that runs on this specific port. So this means that our configurations worked perfect, and we can continue from here to the next step. Alright, so I hope that you understood everything in this video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to raise them in the comment section. So in the next episode, we are going to see how we can use Docker Compose to connect multiple containers very easily. So it is going to be very exciting watching the next video as well. So if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and as well as consider subscribing to my channel, and I will see you very soon in the next episode.